Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve, at least for a little longer, as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank Israel Policy Forum supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. Israel Policy Forum relies on donors like you to produce free expert analysis and informational content on the most pressing issues affecting Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you enjoy Israel Policy Forum's webinars but don't yet support the organization's work, please do so by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. Having launched airstrikes yesterday morning that killed 3 Islamic Jihad leaders and a number of civilians, Israel has begun a military operation in Gaza. Palestinian militants responded today by firing several barrages of rockets at Israeli cities this evening as well. And now we're hearing some talk of a potential ceasefire. As always, Israel Policy Forum stands in support of Israel's security and its defense against threats of rocket attacks from Gaza targeting Israeli towns and cities. And we mourn the loss of civilians, and our thoughts are with those Israelis and Palestinians who are enduring yet another round of fighting. Amir, you have recently noted that mere discussions of a ceasefire can lead to an increase in a barrage of rockets as a show of force prior to a ceasefire being implemented. Meanwhile, the Knesset's summer session has gotten off to a contentious start as the Netanyahu government prepares to pass a state budget before the end of the month, as it must do. So to discuss the ongoing Gaza operation and other political developments, I'm pleased to welcome back our good friend Amir Tibon of Haaretz newspaper. Thanks so much for joining us, Amir.
Hi, Susie, and hello, everyone. It's always a pleasure to speak with Israel Policy Forum, and especially with you, Susie. And I think, we've had several discussions before that focused on events like this. Unfortunately, these periodic operations and deteriorations in Gaza are happening more and more. And there is talk now of a ceasefire, which I hope will materialize. But I will update, through our webinar. If there is breaking news, I will also let you know. But right now, it's still being discussed, but is not finalized.
Thank you, Amir. So if you want to start by telling us the latest developments that you are reporting on at this hour, recognizing that this literally is a breaking news story.
So for the past several hours, we've seen these hints coming out of Egypt, where there are talks between the Egyptian intelligence, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, and the Egyptian side is also speaking to Israel. And this is an interesting dynamic because basically the Egyptians usually play the part of the mediators between Israel and the Palestinian organizations in Gaza. In the past, we've seen them lead to ceasefire agreements between Israel and Hamas. Right now, this round of fighting that has been going on for 48 hours, but in a sense really started last week, and maybe we'll get to it later how it all began, without going back to 1948, just the events of the last week. But this round of fighting is interesting because Hamas has decided to stay out of it, and Israel has decided not to attack Hamas and is only focusing its fire on the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so the dynamic we're seeing is the Egyptians and Hamas together urging the Palestinian Islamic Jihad to agree to a ceasefire, and the Egyptians also talking to the Israeli side. And I'm still, I would say, more optimistic than not that it will reach a conclusion, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow early morning. But right now, the situation on the ground is still one of a war, really. I mean, we're seeing Israeli strikes in Gaza and rocket launches from Gaza toward Israeli communities along the Gaza border and even further into Israel. The last big kind of a barrage of rockets that also included Tel Aviv and its suburbs was more than an hour ago. So maybe that is by itself a sign that we're nearing a ceasefire, and now the Islamic Jihad is focusing more of its efforts on the Gaza border area. But it's still too early to say that this is over. I think, the momentum is clearly in that direction. And the most important thing, Susie, is the fact that Hamas chose not to get involved, because this is what made this entire thing, limited to maybe 2 or 3 days of fighting versus weeks, perhaps, if it had become a conflict between Israel and Hamas.
So Amir, I'm sure some of our viewers know, but maybe not everyone knows, that you don't just report from the Gaza border. You live there. You live on kibbutz Nahal Oz with your family. You're right on the border. You've hosted us at your kibbutz. What has this recent Gaza escalation been like for you and your neighbors? And how do you think it has shaped Gaza envelope residents' perceptions of the government and the current state of the Israeli-Palestinian arena?
So when you live where I do, in kibbutz Nahal Oz, and I have to say right now, I'm not joining you from my home in the kibbutz. I'm joining you from my parents' home in central Israel, because like thousands of Israelis living in the Gaza border area, our family decided yesterday morning to leave our home. When we saw where this was heading and we understood what's about to come, we packed our bag, took our two small daughters. My older is 3 years old and my younger one is a year and a half, and left. And really, if you go now to the communities along the border with Gaza, they are more than half empty, most of them. I mean, this is really thousands of people who left their homes, not knowing for how long this will take, and waiting for a stable ceasefire in order to return. I have to say, in the Gaza border area, you really see the full picture of the Israeli political spectrum. I mean, my kibbutz Nahal Oz is a stronghold of the center-left parties. If our community determined the results of the election, Yair Lapid would still be prime minister with a very stable majority. You drive 10 minutes from Nahal Oz to the largest town in the area, which is Sderot. It's 10 minutes away, and we face the exact same security threats. The mortars and the rockets and the tunnels and the incendiary balloons that have caused huge fires. We have that in Nahal Oz. We have that in Sderot. It's the same. But over there, 80% of the population voted for the religious right-wing parties that make up the current government. And that by itself is an issue for a fascinating discussion we can have one day. How can two communities on the same border, under the same security tensions, vote so differently from one another? But I do think that there is now a sense in our area at large, whether it's in places that are strongholds of Likud, like Sderot, or places that are stronghold of the opposition parties, like Nahal Oz, that this government has failed to deliver security to the Gaza border area. And we can just compare it to the previous government, led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, and they were in power for a year and a half. Most of that year and a half was completely quiet along the border, very, very few cases of rockets being launched. There was one military operation that Lapid led last summer, which lasted 4 days, but it was very concentrated. We knew it was coming, and by the time it was over, the quiet returned. The problem with this government has been that for the last 4 months, we've been having these, what we call, drips and drops of rockets. In a way, when you live in this area, it's easier to have a flood, like, a big rain that is coming, and it's coming, and you know to leave the area and pack your bags and go somewhere else. And it's much more difficult to live under a reality where there is a rocket launched on Tuesday and another one on Thursday, and then 3 rockets on Saturday night. And this is what we've been having for the last few months now with this government. And that's much more difficult because you're not going to append your life, pack your bags, take your kids out of kindergarten. For my wife, who is a social worker and works in our area, leave your job because of 2 or 3 rockets. You will do that when you know there's going to be hundreds of rockets launched at your area, like in the last 2 days. And it's not comfortable to leave your home and take your kids out of their daily routine. But for a few days, you sometimes understand that you have to do it. But with these, few rockets here and there, and that's been the reality under the Netanyahu government, it's much more difficult to maintain a routine. And this is why there is a sense of anger and disappointment toward this government, even in the Likud supporting areas. And I think that was one of the considerations, honestly, behind the government's decision to carry out these strikes yesterday against the Islamic Jihad leadership and decide to start this operation, which maybe will be limited to 2 or 3 days, but shows more of an effort to put an end to these, endless launches, even if they're in small quantities. And this is also what the government will be tested on, Susie. If 2 or 3 days from now, after a ceasefire, we will once again see one rocket on Thursday and one rocket on Sunday and so on and on, this will be a problem for the government.
Amir, let me just follow up on what you're saying about people understandably not feeling that this government is really adequately protecting their security. Can you talk a little bit about how that is manifesting itself? I mean, you just said you think that might be part of the reason for the operations to take out the 3 militants and the other bombings that are going on. But is there pressure on Likud ministers, on the Prime Minister? I mean, are citizens making their voices heard at this point, or is it still kind of too early for that?
One of the problems for this government is that they created unreasonable and unrealistic expectations, because they came in saying now there's going to be a pure right-wing government, right? And Netanyahu has been prime minister for a long time here in Israel with a short break under the previous government, but he has always governed with at least one centrist element within his coalition. Okay, we can go back to 2009. He had a government with Ehud Barak from the Labour Party. Later, he governed with Yair Lapid and Tzipi Livni, and the no longer in existence party of Moshe Kahlon, which was a center-right party, and then a short-lived government with Benny Gantz as his defense minister. And now it's the first time that he's leading a government with no centrists and no moderates. It's just Likud and all the religious and ultra-nationalist and ultra-Orthodox and far-right parties of Israel. And some people voted for that coalition expecting this kind of government. And they said, now there's going to be a real right-wing government and we're going to show everyone that we're so strong and nobody's going to be messing with us. And instead, what we're seeing is reality. And in reality, Israel is facing some very difficult security challenges, both in the occupied territories in the West Bank, where we've seen an uptick in terror attacks. And I think maybe by now 20 Israelis killed in attacks that came out of Jerusalem or East Jerusalem or the West Bank in recent months. And we're seeing it in Gaza, hundreds of rockets launched just today, more than 100 rockets launched last week. And in general, a clear rise in the number of rocket and mortar launches toward Israeli communities since this government took power. We saw it in Passover. If you recall, I know it looked like it was ages ago, but just about a month ago, we had over a 3-day span rocket launched from Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria toward Israel. That does not mean anything good for the level of deterrence that Israel has against its neighbors who are also enemies. And so there is a sense of disappointment and disillusionment with this government. I have to say, as someone who did not vote for the parties in this government, and I don't consider myself a big supporter, I also think maybe some of the criticism is unfair to them because some of these are strategic realities that have been in place for a long time. But the reason they are getting so much criticism is because of the expectations they created and the demagoguery that came along with it, and the claim that if you have a full right-wing government, you will be able to solve these problems and everyone will be afraid of us and will be able to do whatever we want. And so it's really an issue of politicians who made unrealistic promises running into a wall called reality.
Let me tack on one more question on that, because of course we're also seeing reports about the security cabinet that basically can't really function as a security cabinet should, because the people on it, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, not only did not serve and have no security background, he obviously has a criminal ledger, if you will, but I read, Amir, that while Ben Gvir was, banging on the door to be let into a cabinet meeting, a security cabinet meeting that he wasn't allowed to be at, but at the same time, the former Minister for Public Security, Omer Bar-Lev of Labor, right, from the Labor Party, that he's been getting updates on the unfolding security situation. So it does feel a little bit like the world is upside down here. But can you comment on that before we get on to some other issues?
Yeah, the dynamic with Netanyahu and Ben Gvir is very interesting. Ben Gvir was the big winner of the election in November, even bigger than Netanyahu. I mean, together with his partner, Bezalel Smotrich, they took the Israeli far right, brought it to an unprecedented achievement with 14 seats in the Knesset, and gained unprecedented levels of power, with Smotrich becoming the finance minister, controlling the budget, Ben Gvir taking over the police as the internal security minister, and he also got Netanyahu to upgrade his title to national security minister. And they feel like they have some very important rights in the creation of this government. They brought the extra votes that pushed the Netanyahu bloc of parties, Likud and all the religious forces, toward the big majority that it won on election night. But now there is clearly a confrontation, especially between Ben Gvir and Netanyahu, because Netanyahu feels that Ben Gvir took it too far and that he interpreted his big achievement on election night as a mandate to basically control the agenda of the government. So last week, it was a very interesting series of events. A Palestinian prisoner who belonged to the Islamic Jihad and was on hunger strike because he was under administrative detention by Israel for a long, long time, had died in prison. In retaliation for that, Islamic Jihad shot more than 100 rockets toward Israel. Ben Gvir and his party demanded an immediate military reaction. Netanyahu and the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, chose a more moderate path because I think they wanted to plan the strike that we eventually saw on Tuesday morning. And Ben Gvir, angry that the response was not to his taste, announced that his party will no longer show up for votes in the Knesset and basically deprive the government of its majority. So while there was this ongoing crisis between Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, and his party was refusing to vote with the government, the military was planning this counterattack on the Islamic Jihad that we eventually saw 2 days ago. And Ben Gvir was kept in the dark. And so was Smotrich. Netanyahu did not include them in the discussions, did not convene the security cabinet. They had no idea. They found out about the military strike from the media. I mean, in the middle of the night, these push notifications began to come out, and that's when they learned about it. So it's basically a humiliation for them. And Netanyahu made sure to inform the media that this was the case, because he's trying to make Ben Gvir look like a foolish clown, which is not very difficult based on how he behaves and the things that he does and says. But this is not over. Just like Israel and the Islamic Jihad could still clash again weeks from now, I think Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, it's still an ongoing dispute, and Ben Gvir has not said the last word. And I think every time Netanyahu will humiliate him like this, he will look for the next opportunity to strike back at him. How long can you keep a functioning government like this is a very serious question. Of course, it's the only government Netanyahu has right now, because no one from the opposition will agree to join with him because of his criminal indictment and because of his long history of lying and manipulating with political partners. So he's stuck with Ben Gvir, and right now I think this, the last 48 hours, he definitely has the upper hand over Ben Gvir. But this crisis will continue between the two of them. It's inevitable.
That's not a very reassuring scenario, unfortunately, given the security challenges. So Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant announced that security forces are preparing for a multi-front escalation, like what we saw during Operation Guardian of the Walls in 2021. What could prompt this conflict evolving into a more protracted escalation that involves Jerusalem, Israel's mixed cities, or in the West Bank, where Israeli forces have already been carrying out regular anti-terror raids and clashing with militants in Palestinian cities?
So first of all, it's important to remember we got a taste of that last month when again we had this escalation in Gaza. At the same time, terror attacks in the territories, including the one very terrible incident where a mother and two daughters of the D family were murdered by terrorists. And then we also had rocket launches from Lebanon and from Syria. So that was a moment when we felt everything was coalescing, and it could happen again. Hamas is very strategic in how it retaliates against Israel these days. It is trying to keep Gaza quiet because in Gaza, it is busy rebuilding its capabilities from the damages of 2021, while also trying to improve the local economy. Remember, there are about 15,000 workers from Gaza who now go out every day to work in Israel, and they bring money back into the Gaza Strip, and that's very important for whatever is left of the miserable local economy. So Hamas actually has an interest to keep things quieter in Gaza, while at the same time creating turmoil in the West Bank, where it is competing with the Palestinian Authority and benefits from any kind of tensions between Israel and the PA. And we saw now that Hamas also has an arm in Lebanon that it built over the years under the watchful eye of Hezbollah with a wink, and they used it during Passover when they wanted to send the message to Israel. They did it with strikes from Lebanon. And so the potential for another kind of escalation on a regional level exists. Next week, we're going to have in Jerusalem the annual Flag March, which is an event of the religious right wing in Israel when they march through the streets of the old city of Jerusalem with flags to commemorate the Six-Day War. Every year there are tensions around it. 2 years ago, it was actually the day that started Operation Guardian of the Walls when Hamas, in order to stop that march, shot rockets at Jerusalem. And that's how it all started. And yeah, the tension is far from over. I mean, we passed through the month of Ramadan with a lot of terror attacks and rocket launches, but yet not a full-blown war. It's still a very delicate situation, even after tonight, if there will be a ceasefire, and especially toward next week with whatever will happen in Jerusalem.
Thanks, Amir. Could you talk a little bit, please, about the regional and international responses to the operation in Gaza? What is your sense of how Israel's partners in the Arab world view the ongoing military conflict?
I just want to say, Susie, I'm hearing some booms around me now in Tel Aviv as we speak. I want to check for a second if I can update you
Of course.
on something.
And if you have to go to a mamad, we understand.
No, I'm in a safe place. I don't see any updates about launches. Maybe it's sometimes if it's something that is if it's rockets that are launched and Iron Dome recognizes that they are going to land in the sea, we don't even get an alert. So maybe this is the case. Clearly, there is some booms indicating action. And it's not unusual, by the way, that in the hours before a ceasefire, we will actually have an increase in the number of rockets being fired, because if they already took them out of the warehouses, they want to use them while they can. Regarding the international reaction, I think this government entered the current escalation knowing that it does not have a lot of time on its hands. Usually when Israel starts one of these military operations in Gaza, the most important mission that Israeli diplomats have is to buy time, is to explain to the world what Israel is trying to achieve, what kind of threat Israeli citizens are exposed to by the rockets and mortars and missiles from Gaza, and at the same time, make the argument that Israel wants to reach a ceasefire, but the other side is not ready. And usually, you will see those arguments run their course at some point. In Guardian of the Walls 2 years ago, it took about 10 days for President Biden to finally put his foot on the gas and say enough. In the beginning of the operation, the Biden White House said, we support Israel's right to defend itself, and we are going to stand with Israel. And they did. I think they gave Israel 10 days to really deal with this. And when the escalation spread throughout the country and into Lebanon as well, and was becoming a more of a regional issue, that's when the president intervened. I think with this government, we would have seen that kind of intervention much sooner if this were to continue into 5 or 6 days. I mean, this government starts whatever it wants to do on any security front, really, with very low credibility. because of the composition of the government, because it has such extreme people in positions of power like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And I have to say, Susie, Ben-Gvir has not really helped Netanyahu in the international scene, because when the strikes in Gaza took place the other night, and yes, 3 Islamic Jihad leaders were killed, but also, unfortunately, a large number of civilians, including women and children, he came out and gave a statement basically presenting this as a political achievement of his own, arguing that because of the ultimatum he gave Netanyahu and because his party did not show up for Knesset votes, Netanyahu got to his senses and decided to carry out with these strikes. That's a complete nonsense. I mean, completely detached from reality. But you know, when a person with the title National Security Minister says something like that, some people will actually believe him in Israel and abroad. I had a conversation about this with a senior Western diplomat who said, we get questions about this. People say, is this the guy who sends the planes, the National Security Minister? It's a big title. And it takes time to explain who this guy really is and what his level of involvement is. But that certainly hasn't helped. And so the government starts from a place where most of the world is suspicious and skeptical of its actions. And we saw some pretty strong worded reactions from Europe. I think the French were the most, negative in their reaction. And also from important countries in the Arab world. And when I say important countries, I mean countries that Israel really cares about its relationship with. Our immediate neighbors, Jordan and Egypt, who are also security partners, and we count on the Egyptians especially as mediators and the only people who can help us calm down and de-escalate. And our new allies in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, who is our official friend, Saudi Arabia, with whom we hope to have an official friendship at some point. And they've also expressed their displeasure with the actions of this government, whether it's in the issue of Temple Mount, settlement building, and also in Gaza. And so this is a government that has to take into consideration a more hostile international arena than previous Israeli governments when it approaches a military operation in Gaza.
I'm going to switch gears a bit, but I also want to remind our audience, please, if you have a question for Amir, please submit it in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of your questions in the second half of the hour as we can. So, as we all know, Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to pause the government's package of legislation intended to give the government more control over the country's judiciary, otherwise known as Judicial Overhaul. That was over a month ago, before the Passover holiday, and the Knesset has since returned from its recess, but the focus now rightly is on passing the budget because it has to do so by May 29th, otherwise the government will automatically fall. So given the state of affairs and now the operations in Gaza, what is the state of the judicial overhaul? Is anything coming out of the negotiations facilitated by President Isaac Herzog? And do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu has any appetite to resume pushing forward with the legislation unilaterally if the two sides can't find points of compromise?
Those are all very important questions. Right now, the judicial overhaul is frozen. It's been frozen since March 27th, when Netanyahu announced that he was putting it on hold. It's a result of the wild reaction of the Israeli public to his decision the night before to fire Defense Minister Gallant, a decision that he has since reversed. And we saw that they seem a little closer now working on this operation. And Gallant, of course, emerged as the big winner. I mean, Netanyahu did not fire him. And in addition, Netanyahu adopted the policy recommendation for which he wanted to fire him, which was to pause the legislation because the legislation had a very dangerous impact on the cohesion of Israeli society, including within the military. Does Netanyahu want to go back to this? I don't think so. I think Netanyahu's government has been going down significantly in all public opinion polls ever since this issue became the main subject of discussion in the country. A coalition with 64 seats is winning about 50 to 52 in the polls. That is terrible. I mean, they're just crashing. And Netanyahu wants to try to improve his own public standing and maybe focus on other more consensus and popular issues, like, for example, trying to reach peace with Saudi Arabia, which he is again talking about. And we saw senior officials from the Biden administration visit Saudi Arabia this week and then arrive in Jerusalem to meet with him. I think we're still a far, way ahead from that, but he would rather focus on that. He has a serious problem, though, because there are very strong pressures against continuing this legislation. Internally in Israel, the protest movement that you've all probably been seeing for the last 18 weeks, and I think the protests are going to continue. I don't think this security crisis with the Islamic Jihad, especially if there's a ceasefire in the next 24 hours, will keep people away from going to demonstrate on Saturday night. And then there are also economic factors, which are very important. We already saw Moody's credit rating agency downgrade Israel's credit outlook. There's supposed to be another report this Friday from S&P, Standard & Poor's, which is also a very important, Standard & Poor's, sorry, which is also a very important credit rating agency. And there was a story this morning in one of the economic newspapers in Israel that Netanyahu spoke on the phone with the analysts who are writing this report and promised them that the legislation will not be promoted in its original character. And if anything comes to a vote, it will be a more consensus kind of document that will be reached through negotiations with the opposition. And he said that in order to convince them not to be the second agency to downgrade Israel's credit outlook. And we'll see if he succeeded. But that was a very important headline. And we also saw today a report by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, warning that the judicial overhaul, if it is passed, would lead to economic damages to Israel. So, that's another source of pressure. And there's also the pressure that, we know from the military. We talked about the fear that military units will disintegrate as a result of this legislation, that especially in the reserve forces, people will not show up for duty because they will say, we signed a contract to defend a Jewish democratic state of Israel, not a semi-dictatorial country. And last but not least, there is international pressure. We heard President Biden say very clearly that he's not inviting Netanyahu to the White House until this thing is resolved. And I think that's actually a wise move by the president, because think about it. Imagine that he will invite Netanyahu to the White House, and a week later, Netanyahu will pass this legislation. How will Biden, who has staked his presidency on the protection of democracy at home and abroad, look, if something like that happened? So I think all those factors are pushing Netanyahu toward the place of saying, let's just slowly kill this thing. Let's just, keep talking at the president's residence. If an agreement comes out of those talks, great. I personally am a bit skeptical. If nothing comes out of it, then it will slowly die. The problem is that he's also facing pressure from the other side. The extremists within his coalition understand what he's doing. They organized their own large protests 2 weeks ago in favor of this legislation. It was an impressive protest, and they're continuing to put pressure on him from the other side. I think that for Netanyahu to hold on to his current place of basically not deciding here or there, both sides will have to continue pressuring him. And this is the game that we're going to see in the next few weeks. His coalition partners will increase the pressure to pass the legislation. And by doing that, ironically, they will increase the pressure of the other side, because people who oppose this legislation, and maybe they've gotten tired after 18 weeks of protest, and they want to spend a quiet Saturday night with friends or family instead of going to demonstrate, they're going to see the pressure from the religious right, and they're going to say, you know what? We also have to keep the pressure up now. So I think this is, how it's going to play out. And of course, there is still a very, very important role here for the Biden administration, for Israel's friends in Washington, D.C., and in the American Jewish community, to keep speaking up about this and not, lose focus, because this is not over yet.
Well, I think many of us on this call take this to heart, what you're saying, Amir. Let's talk a little bit more about the budget discussions, the negotiations, because that is happening. And as I said, they have 18 days to figure it out. What are the political battles in store over the content of the budget itself? Are there disagreements within the coalition over its content that need to be resolved? And provided that Ben-Gvir and the Haredi party's unrelated concerns are addressed, do you anticipate it passing without an issue? And let me ask a related question to the Haredim, because the Haredi parties, including particularly Agudat Israel, have issued their own ultimatum to Netanyahu over passing a law to exempt Haredim from the IDF draft. Is there a real concern that they could torpedo the budget over this precise issue? So given that the current exemption of Haredi men from the draft is set to expire this summer, how do you think the government will handle the issue in the weeks ahead, and how does that impact the budget negotiations that are ongoing?
So I'll start with budget and move on to ultra-Orthodox military service, although the two issues are related, and I explained this is actually quite complicated for Netanyahu. He must pass a budget by May 29, or else the Knesset dissolves and we get new elections. The draft of the budget that the government is currently proposing is a fake budget because it is based on an estimate of how much tax revenue the state of Israel will have that was done before the judicial overhaul spooked the high-tech companies, the investors, and Israelis with a lot of money who have been sending their money to other countries. And so what we're seeing is that there is a drop in the amount of tax revenue collected by the state. There is really a crisis in the high-tech sector. Some of it is part of an international crisis in the tech sector, but some of it is unique to Israel because of the impacts of the judicial overhaul. And we have seen this phenomenon, and the Israeli banks have been surprisingly transparent about it, of people removing funds out of the country because they are concerned about what Netanyahu's government is doing. I think that has actually slowed down since March 27, when he decided to put the legislation on hold. But the result is there's going to be less money available for the budget. But, you know, Susie, in the ultra-Orthodox schools, unfortunately, they don't teach math and science, and maybe their members of Knesset are not so good with the numbers. And so as the number of, as the overall amount of available money is going down, their budgetary demands in the coalition talks are actually going up, and they are demanding more and more budget for their schools, which is a tragedy because, like I said, these are schools that don't teach math and English and science, and yet they're going to get more and more state funding. Billions of dollars will be invested in it. Ben-Gvir is demanding a huge amount of money to set up this new National Guard that he wants to have under his control. Smotrich wants more money for the settlements and for strongholds of the religious Zionist population. Everybody's got their demands. Where's the money going to come from? This is a real problem for them. It's less of a coalition problem internally, but it's a problem between these parties and the finance minister. Now, Netanyahu could decide to go full populist, Argentina style, and just to say, okay, so we'll just break the top line of the budget. He's never done that. I mean, his whole shtick has been to talk about how, as a finance minister 20 years ago, he was the responsible adult who cut government spending, forced the ultra-Orthodox to start working and joining the job market because he cut all of their subsidies, and balanced Israel's budget. Is he willing to flip the script, throw that legacy in the trash, and become the prime minister who broke the budget to please his ultra-Orthodox partners? Maybe, I don't know, maybe he's that desperate, but it's a real problem. On top of that, there is an issue with Likud. Likud is still a party that attracts a significant number of relatively more secular Jewish Israelis. Okay, in Israel, we have this kind of spectrum from ultra-Orthodox to different variations of national religious, a bit like your modern Orthodox, to secular, but within the secular, you have more traditional secular, and then you have more secular. Likud has a strong base of support among the more traditional seculars. These are Israelis who are somewhere on this spectrum between religious and secular. They don't like religious coercion. They're not happy with the ultra-Orthodox getting all these budgets. And they're certainly not happy that they send their kids to the military while the ultra-Orthodox are exempted from service. And so the budget and the draft law are becoming politically embarrassing issues for Likud, because these are also easy issues for the opposition parties, Lapid, Gantz, Lieberman, to attack the government and say it's leading Israel in the wrong direction in service of the narrow interests of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And there is a real question of how will the members of Knesset of Likud respond to these demands from the ultra-Orthodox. What Netanyahu is trying to do right now, because he realizes how unpopular all these moves are, he's trying to do what he always does, which is buy time. He's trying to separate the passing of the budget from the passing of the ultra-Orthodox military exemption law. Originally, the ultra-Orthodox parties told him, we will only vote for the budget and allow the government to stay alive if you first of all pass the law exempting our men from military service officially. But now Netanyahu is telling the ultra-Orthodox, we have to split it. We have to pass the budget, first of all, so the government survives. And in a few months, when the public atmosphere will go down and the judicial overhaul maybe will be in the rearview mirror, we won't be talking about it anymore. And maybe I'll have some diplomatic achievements that will stabilize my standing in public opinion. I'll go to the White House, I'll meet the Saudi foreign minister, stuff like that. Then we will pass the service exemption law. Will the ultra-Orthodox parties agree to this delay? I mean, they'll be paying up front by passing the budget, but, and yes, the budget is wonderful for them. It's got all this, things that they need, but the military exemption law will have to wait. Interesting question. So this is a very problematic a political issue for Netanyahu to resolve. Of course, with his experience, I think he may be able to find a solution, but it's not going to be easy, and he's going to get hit in public opinion. I mean, he's going to pay a price for both these budgets going to the ultra-Orthodox and eventually also the draft law.
So, B'kitzur, no good choices for Bibi Netanyahu.
Oh, no. Well, listen, it's his own making, right? So he chose these coalition partners. Now he's going to have to live with it.
Absolutely. You mentioned Ben Gvir's National Guard, and we actually have a question from an audience member, Bob Hornstein. Does Netanyahu have any real intention to allow Ben Gvir to form a National Guard under his control? And Amir, I see you're checking. Do you need to take a pause?
Yeah. No, I'm looking at updates now. I wanted to tell you guys. We're seeing a little more pessimism, I have to say, about a ceasefire tonight. There's still launches of rockets from Gaza continuing and the strikes by Israel. So I don't know, it may take another day or two. But regarding the National Guard, this is a good question. And what I want to say is, I think there will be a National Guard at some point. I don't think it will be under the command of Itamar Ben-Gvir. I think what they're going to do is, first of all, approve the budget for it, which by itself is quite an issue, because they're going to have to cut funding from other government ministries for this, and that will create a lot of unhappy politicians in this coalition. Then they're going to set up a committee that is going to decide on how exactly the National Guard will work and who will it work under. Then they're going to have to recruit people to serve in it. I mean, this is a plan for a few thousands of people. You need to do recruitment and build it and have a whole structure and process. By the time that is over, and Susie, you know how long these issues usually take in Israel. I mean, have you enjoyed riding the Tel Aviv subway in the last few years? The one that, of course, doesn't yet exist, yet it was supposed to be many years ago. I don't think it will be, happen so fast. And this is another example of the kind of political price that Netanyahu pays for his alliance with Ben-Gvir. So many people are worried about this National Guard and criticizing Netanyahu for giving an Israeli fascist. I mean, this is Ben-Gvir, okay? I don't use that word easily, but Ben-Gvir really deserves it. To have his own kind of private militia. He's getting hit for it in public opinion, and yet nothing has actually happened yet. It's not, it's not here. We don't even know if Ben-Gvir will get it in the way he wants to. And again, this is the kind of price that he's paying for setting up a government with someone like Ben-Gvir, who also is very media savvy and knows how to create headlines that will improve his own standing with the far right, while at the same time hurt Netanyahu with the more centrist moderate right.
Do you expect Ben-Gvir to do something provocative regarding the Temple Mount or elsewhere on Jerusalem Day?
Would you be surprised if he did? I mean,
No.
before this security situation with Gaza started, the biggest story we had in the first 2 days of this week was Ben-Gvir's attempt to blow up what we call Europe Day here in Israel. Basically, and this is a small story, but I'll tell it because it just explains what we're dealing with here. Every year, the European Union delegation in Israel organizes a festive event for Europe Day, which is marked in the beginning of May, and I think commemorates the foundation of the European Union. And you'll have...
I thought it was Victory in Europe Day, May 8th. I thought that's what it was in World War II, but I could be wrong.
I think it's May 9th, and it's something
okay.
But yeah,
sorry.
it's basically
okay,
built
so
on, it's built, one layer over the other. And so every year you will have a government minister come and say a few words during this event about the strong friendship between Israel and Europe. And you'll have a speech by, the EU ambassador and one other European ambassador, and some cocktails and food and, a cultural, like a music concert and some activities for kids. And it was just like a boring, nice little event. This year, for a reason that's not clearly understood, someone in the government, in the like the cabinet office of the government, these are clerks, it's not a political decision, decided to send Itamar Ben-Gvir as the government representative for Europe Day. The one minister in the government that, except for maybe Hungary, which by itself is adopting a very far-right political approach, but every other country in Europe despises everything this man stands for: the racism, the support for violence, his involvement in the past in, Kahana, which is, marked as a terrorist organization. I mean, just completely despicable in the eyes of Europe, and also in the eyes of many Israelis, I have to say. To send him to be the government representative at this event is such a stupid idea. At first, the Europeans thought Ben-Gvir will understand that he's not wanted and he will cancel. But Ben-Gvir did the opposite. He saw an opportunity for a provocation that will, create media attention, and he insisted that he's coming to give us a speech there. And not only that, he said that in his speech, he's going to reprimand the Europeans for their support of the Palestinians. So, of course, the Europeans canceled the event. And there was no reception and no speeches, and it was just like a concert for families. This is what survived of Europe Day. And this was a completely unnecessary diplomatic crisis and embarrassment between Israel and the European Union. And it happened 3 days after the Israeli foreign minister, Eli Cohen from Likud, had visited the EU headquarters in Brussels, met with the European foreign minister, and said that he was proud to begin a fresh page in the Israeli-European relationship. I mean, this is what Ben-Gvir does. And for Netanyahu, it's just like one continuous headache, and one embarrassment after the other. And I have to say, I don't pity Netanyahu for this, because I think bringing Ben-Gvir and the Kahana movement into the Israeli government and giving him control of the police is one of the most outrageous things any Israeli prime minister had ever done. I think it will be a huge stain on Netanyahu's legacy that he legitimized Kahanism in the Israeli political discourse. And at least he's paying the price for it right now, and getting a taste of the medicine that he helped create.
Nagia lo.
Okay.
As you know, Amir, Netanyahu has certainly in the past leveraged security crises in order to overcome political challenges and shore up support for his government. Given the political turmoil he's currently facing, and you just gave a really good summary of one aspect of that turmoil, do you see Bibi benefiting politically from the ongoing Gaza operation, and how do you think that will influence steps going forward?
I will separate my answer into two levels. There is the level of stabilizing the existing coalition, and there's the level of public opinion. I definitely think this operation will stabilize the coalition. I think the Ben Gvir revolt of last week, when he stopped showing up for votes, is over for now. It could be renewed later on. Like I said, Ben Gvir is not the last one, but I think right now Netanyahu has stabilized the coalition. In terms of public opinion, I think it's too early to judge. If this was over today in the morning, like 12 hours ago, Netanyahu would have been the big winner. I mean, he killed the Islamic Jihad guys. They barely retaliated, and we moved on, and he would have been, pumping on his chest and saying, look at me, look what I did. Now, in the evening, it looks a little different, okay? We've been through a day here with more than 400 rocket launches. It's continuing as we speak. There is no ceasefire right now. I just saw earlier an update about direct hits on homes in Ashkelon and one kibbutz on the border. I don't think there are any casualties. I will just take one more quick look. But, it's not looking so great right now. It's ongoing. And so I don't know if this will help him in terms of public opinion. I mean, if people feel that, we killed these three Islamic Jihad leaders, but so what? They then for an entire day shot hundreds of rockets at us. What has really been achieved? And then, like I said, there are still the crises that are coming with the budget, with the ultra-Orthodox military service. So even if this will help him in the short term, the problems he's facing because of the coalition are not going away. But I think it will help him stabilize the coalition for now.
I was struck, by the way, when you were talking earlier, Amir, about Bibi possibly raising the debt ceiling. We have some familiarity with that issue right now and try to pass the budget. So we don't have the issue of rockets coming across our border to complicate matters, but certainly on some of the budgetary headaches, I think we can certainly identify in ways that we would rather not.
Susie, I have to say, I was I had some meeting today, and the television was open on CNN, and the headlines were about, first of all, the Pakistani former prime minister who had just been arrested, Imran Khan. And then it moved on to Trump and his case in New York. And now that he, the jury said that he was, that he had sexually assaulted a woman and will have to pay, I think, $5 million.
That's right.
And then I thought about what's happening over here with the Netanyahu trial, because there were also headlines about that here today in Israel. Weird things are happening all over the world right now, but a lot of them seem to do with leaders who misuse power in different ways. We'll see where it all goes. And we haven't even spoken about Turkey on Sunday, which is a big test by itself for democracy. And
sure, whether or not
some of these issues really are global right now.
They absolutely are. Okay, last question from Adam Odisser. With all the problems within the government, we know coalition partners have an interest, in a sense, to keep their seats, but how long do you expect this government to hold? Do you think we're looking at a 3 to 4 year term, or are we, as we are used to, do you expect elections to be sooner?
Hi, Adam, good question. Listen, I'm not a forecaster, and I'm not a prophet. I cannot foresee the future. Right now, it doesn't look very stable. I mean, for a government with 64 seats, they fight all the time. The flagship issue that the government started on with the Judicial Overhaul is now dividing it. Ben Gvir is completely unexpected, and he's losing a lot of support in the polls and may have an interest at some point to resign, say that Netanyahu blocked his initiatives because Netanyahu is a leftist, and then try to kind of appeal again to his base on the far right. On the other hand, maybe the fact that they're losing so badly in the polls and deteriorating so fast is the glue that will keep them together. The fear of another election will help them kind of, just slowly move along and just survive another day. And of course, there's another question that will influence this, which is, will Netanyahu's far-right partners begin to suspect that he's trying to bring Benny Gantz into the government instead of them. And if they begin to suspect that he's planning that, maybe they would want to blow it up before him. While at the same time, if Netanyahu thinks that Ben Gvir is already thinking about the crisis that he will use to bring on the government, maybe it gives him more of an incentive to try to form another kind of coalition. I think, Gantz and Netanyahu, they tried to cooperate 3 years ago during that emergency government under COVID. Gantz was a loyal partner, a real patriot, put aside his political considerations, almost committed political suicide for that government. Netanyahu cheated him, lied to him, humiliated him. For Gantz to join a Netanyahu government, again, the price would have to be very, very high. For example, I don't see a scenario where Gantz comes in unless he gets the Justice Ministry, which would basically be the final nail in the coffin of any kind of judicial overhaul or what they call reform. Can Netanyahu agree to that? Can his party accept that? Those are big questions. And so I think even if Netanyahu wants to think about political alternatives instead of this hellish, nightmarish government, I'm not sure he really has any.
Well, we'll have a lot to talk about in the coming weeks and months. And of course, Amir, you're always a welcome guest, and we learned so much from you. So thank you very much for joining us today, this evening in Israel, especially with everything going on. And we certainly hope that you are able to return to Nahal Oz quickly, that the situation will calm down very soon, and that there will be a ceasefire and one that will hold. Once again, a big thank you to Israel Policy Forum supporters who are with us on today's call. This is my final webinar as chair of Israel Policy Forum, though I hope you will see me in this seat again because I rather like it. But I can say for certain that while we provide our content for free, none of it is free to produce. So if you enjoy this webinar and our other offerings, our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, our weekly Kaplo column, and the other useful online tools found on our website, please support our work by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the briefings page of the Israel Policy Forum website. You can also visit our website to access recordings of previous briefings and sign up to receive the Kaplo column every Thursday if you don't already get it. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding the next Israel Policy Forum video briefing. Until then, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you soon, and Hamon Todot, Erev Tov, Amir. Ad apam haba.
And Susie, thank you for everything that you do, and for another great discussion. It's always fun to talk to you.
Thank you, Amir. Take care.